There are some places that already feel haunted before anything bad ever happens there. A dark road in Louisiana, swamp air hanging heavy at night, Spanish moss moving in the trees, and somewhere in St. Bernard Parish, hidden away from the normal world, there was a cemetery that people whispered about for decades. But this was not a cemetery for people. It was a cemetery for animals, dogs, cats, birds, monkeys, exotic pets, thousands of them buried across the land with tiny headstones, crosses, statues, flowers, and faded messages from owners who loved them like family. The place was called Azalea Original Pet Cemetery. And depending on who asks, Azalea was either beautiful, peaceful, and emotional, or one of the strangest places in Louisiana. Locals told stories about the property. Some said it was haunted, some said money had been buried there years earlier. Treasure hunters came looking for hidden cash. People walked through the graves hoping to find clues. And over time, the cemetery became less like a normal burial ground and more like a piece of Southern folklore. But the darkest story connected to the Azalea was not buried treasure. It was about a woman named Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy owned the cemetery. She loved the land, she protected it, and she believed someone had tricked her out of it. She fought back in court. Then just days before that legal fight was supposed to move forward, Dorothy disappeared. And when her body surfaced in the Mississippi River, investigators believed this was not random. They believed this was about greed. And they believed Dorothy had been killed because someone wanted Azalea badly enough to remove her from the picture. But knowing who did it and proving who did it are two different stories, right? Because this murder was sit unsolved for almost 30 years. This is the story of the real Pet Cemetery murder, the ghost of Azalea. Chapter 1, the Cemetery of Legend. The property stretched across 14 acres, which is massive for a pet cemetery. This was not just a little backyard memorial with a few stones. This was a full cemetery with thousands of animals buried across the land. Some graves were simple, just a small marker, a name, and maybe a date. Others were elaborate. Little statues, personal messages, decorative memorials, graves that show how deeply people love their pets. To some visitors, Azalea was touching. It showed that even animals who live short lives could leave a permanent mark on the humans who love them. But to other people, the cemetery felt unsettling. Because when you walk through a place like that, you are surrounded by love and grief all at the same time. Every grave means somebody lost something. Every marker means somebody cared enough to come back. Because this was Louisiana, the stories around Azalea only grew. People claimed there was buried money somewhere on the property. Nobody could prove it though. Some believed Dorothy or her family had hidden a fortune. Some believed treasure was tucked somewhere under the cemetery ground. Others just liked the mystery. Before long, Azalea had ghosts, treasure hunters, and rumors. But at the center of it all was Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy was a wealthy heiress, independent, eccentric, and deeply attached to the cemetery. To locals, Dorothy and Azalea were connected. If you talked about one, you eventually had to talk about the other. This land was not just a business to her. It was a part of her life. But valuable land attracts attention. And while Dorothy saw Azalea as something to protect, someone else saw it as something to take. Chapter 2, The Handyman. In 1980, a young man named Brandon Nodler came into Dorothy Thompson's life. He was in his 20s at the time. He started doing work around the property. Now, from the outside, that may not have seemed strange. A 14-acre pet cemetery needs maintenance, graves need care, and buildings get old, right? The land needs someone to take care of it while it's falling apart. And Dorothy needed help, and Brandon was available. So at first, the arrangement may have seemed harmless, but Brandon was not just fixing things and leaving. Over time, he became more connected to Dorothy in the cemetery. According to later reports, Brandon had worked as a handyman for Dorothy and her mother. Eventually, he was not just some worker on the property. He was close enough to Dorothy's affairs that people began to worry. Some people later described him as manipulative. Others believed he had a way of inserting himself into vulnerable situations and finding a way to benefit. And that is important here because control does not always happen overnight. Sometimes it starts small, a favor, a repair, a conversation, a person who was always around, a person who becomes useful, then trusted. By the time people notice what's happening, that person may already have influence. And in Dorothy's case, Brandon's influence grew into something almost believable. A legal arrangement that made people ask one question: how did this happen? Chapter 3, The Deal That Made No Sense. At some point, Dorothy signed a 99-year lease giving Brandon control over the cemetery. 99 years for $20 a month? Even for the early 1980s, that sounds ridiculous. We're talking about 14 acres of land, a known cemetery, thousands of burial plots, and somehow Brandon had control over it for basically nothing. People around Dorothy questioned it. Why would she agree to something like that? Did she understand what she was signing? Was she pressured? Was she misled? Investigators would later believe Brandon may have exploited Dorothy's condition and personal struggles, but the lease was only part of the issue, because later, documents surfaced suggesting the property had allegedly been sold to Brandon for $20,000. Again, 14 acres, that number shocked people. Dorothy eventually claimed she had been tricked. She believed she had been deceived into signing away her land. And once she realized what had happened, she did not just accept it. She filed a lawsuit. Now, this was no longer just a strange arrangement between a cemetery owner and a handyman. This was a legal fight over land, and that changed everything. Because if Dorothy won, Brandon could lose Azalea. He could lose control. He could lose the property. He could lose whatever the future he believed he had built around it. Dorothy wanted her cemetery back. Brandon wanted to keep it. And as the court battle moved closer, the pressure started building because Dorothy was still alive. And as long as Dorothy was alive, she could testify. She could fight. She could tell a judge she had been deceived. And that made her dangerous to anyone who needed her silence. Chapter 4, 10 days before court. By April of 1985, Dorothy's lawsuit was moving forward. A major court event was approaching. This was supposed to be the moment where the fight over Azalea moved one step closer to an answer. Then 10 days before the court date, Dorothy vanished. And right away, the timing looked impossible to ignore. Dorothy was not someone with no reason to be around. She had every reason to stay involved. She was fighting for her land. She was trying to regain control of the cemetery she loved. She had a lawsuit underway. So when she suddenly disappeared, people were worried. Where was Dorothy? Had she left on her own? Was she hiding? Or had someone made sure she would never make it to court? That last question became the one investigators could not escape. Because when someone disappears right before a court battle, and their disappearance benefits another person, detectives are going to look hard at that person who benefited. In this case, Brandon Adler became the obvious focus. Authorities believed the motive was clear. If Dorothy was alive, the lawsuit could threaten Brandon's control of the land. If Dorothy was gone, the lawsuit became much harder to pursue. But suspicion is not enough. Police cannot believe something did not happen. A whole town can whisper about it, but in court, you need evidence. At first, investigators did not have enough. No confession, no strong witness, no arrest. And for a while, Dorothy was still just a missing woman. Chapter 5, The Body in the River. On May 2nd, 1985, fishermen, when they noticed something in the Mississippi River. The river carries all kinds of things: branches, trash, broken pieces of wood. But this was not debris. It was a body. The body was Dorothy Thomas. And the scene was terrifying. Dorothy had been suffocated. A plastic bag and wire were found around her head and neck area. They suggested the killer wanted Dorothy to sink and stay hidden beneath the water. Nobody remained. Nobody means fewer questions. Nobody means weaker case. Nobody means the person responsible has a better chance of walking away. But the plan failed. The river gave her back. Investigators believed she had not died in the water. She had been killed somewhere else and dumped afterward. And one of the most disturbing claims connected to the case was that Dorothy may have been killed at the cemetery itself, the place she loved, the place she was fighting to keep. That is what makes this case feel so dark, because Azalea was already surrounded by ghost stories. He had people saying strange things happened there. But now the cemetery was connected to something. Detectives focused on Brandon, prime suspect. The land dispute gave them motive. The timing gave them suspicion. But they still did not have enough to arrest him. So the case stalled. And then slowly, it went cold. Chapter 6, Years of Silence. After Dorothy's murder, life moved forward, but Azalea did not move forward in the same way. The cemetery began to deteriorate. Weeds spread across graves, markers faded, the property became more abandoned. For Dorothy's loved ones, the silence had to be painful. Imagine knowing Dorothy had been fighting for her land. Imagine knowing she disappeared right before court. Imagine knowing her body was found, chained in the Mississippi River. Imagine knowing the investigators had a suspect, but there was no arrest. That is the nightmare of a cold case. It is not just that someone died. It is the fact that people left behind have to keep living with the unanswered questions. Who did it? And why has no one paid for it? Authorities still believed Brandon Adler was involved, but belief is not proof. Prosecutors needed enough evidence to bring charges and win. For years, they did not have it. So Brandon remained free. No trial, no sentence. And as the years turned into decades, people began to believe the truth might never come out. But secrets are strange. Sometimes they stay hidden forever, and sometimes after enough time passes, somebody finally gets tired of carrying them. Chapter 7, The Ghost Start Talking. Around 2012, Nearly 27 years after Dorothy Thompson was killed, investigators got the break they have been waiting for. A witness came forward, and this is where the story gets even stranger, because the real investigation and the ghost stories around Azalea started to overlap. At one point, investigators had even used a psychic while trying to understand the case. The psychic reportedly believed Dorothy had been killed in the cemetery she owned and operated. And according to the reports, two people also claimed they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area. Now, whether you believe in ghosts or not, that part almost does not matter, because sometimes a haunting is not supernatural. Sometimes it is guilt. Sometimes it is a memory. Sometimes it is a secret that sits inside a person for so many years that it starts to feel alive. Later reporting said the case relied heavily on testimony from someone who claimed they saw Brandon kill Dorothy and put her body in the Mississippi River. That was the detail investigators had been missing. For 30 years, Brandon was a suspect, but now they finally had something they could use. Chapter 8, The Arrest. On April 25th, 2012, Brandon Nalla was arrested in connection with Dorothy Thompson's murder. By then, he was in his late 50s. Dorothy had been dead for 27 years. The arrest shocked people, but it also gave many of them hope, because cold cases can start to feel impossible after that much time. Witnesses get older, memories fade, evidence disappears. And eventually, people start thinking justice is not coming. But this time, it did. Authorities said Brandon had been the prime suspect from the beginning, but they had not enough evidence to arrest him earlier. That is what makes this case so frustrating. It was not the investigators had no idea where to look. They did. They had a suspect, they had a motive, they had the land dispute, they had the timing, but they did not have the missing piece. And without that, the case sat for decades. After the witness came forward, prosecutors finally had a chance to move. Still charging someone in an old murder case is risky. The defense can attack everything. Why did the witness wait so long? How clear is their memory? Where's the physical evidence? What records are missing? Who has died since then? That is the challenge with justice delayed. Even when authorities believe they finally gave the right person, the case is not strong as it would have been in 1985. Time damages everything, but prosecutors moved forward anyway, because after 27 years, Dorothy Thompson finally had the chance to be heard. Chapter 9, Justice, but not perfect justice. In 2014, Brandon Nalla pleaded guilty to reduced charges of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And for a lot of people, 10 years did not feel like enough. Dorothy was killed. Her body was chained and dumped in the Mississippi River. Her case sat unsolved for almost 3 decades. So yes, 10 years felt light. Even officials acknowledged the case had challenges. There was always a risk in going to trial with limited evidence, especially when the murder happened so long ago. That is probably why the plea deal mattered. It avoided the uncertainty of a trial. It guaranteed some accountability. It meant Brandon Nalla would finally be legally responsible for Dorothy's death. Was it the ending everyone wanted? No, but it was the ending. And in cold cases, sometimes even an imperfect ending matters. Because for years, Dorothy's story had been trapped between rumors and silence. People talked about treasure. People talked about ghosts. People talked about Azalea like it was a creepy place with strange legend. But behind all of it was a real woman, Dorothy Thomas. Dorothy Thompson was not just the owner of a weird cemetery. She was someone who loved her land, someone who believed it had been taken from her, someone who tried to fight through the legal system, and someone who disappeared right before that fight could reach a courtroom. Her case deserved more than whispers. It deserved an answer. In nearly 30 years, that answer finally came. The Azalea Original Pet Cemetery is one of those places where the truth feels almost stranger than fiction. The murder case stayed unsolved for almost 30 years. It sounds like something out of a horror novel. But Dorothy Thompson's story was real, and the scariest part was not the cemetery. It wasn't the graves, and it wasn't the ghost stories. The scariest part was how easily greed can turn personal. How someone can see land, money, opportunity where someone else sees home, history, and love. Dorothy fought for Azalea because it mattered to her. She wanted her cemetery back. And according to investigators, that fight may have cost her life. For years, her murder was buried under time, but eventually, the silence cracked. A witness came forward. The case reopened. Brandon Nalla was arrested, and in 2014, he was sentenced. The punishment may have not felt equal to the crime, but the truth finally had a name to attach to it. So when people talk about the ghost of Azalea, maybe they are talking about more than just spirits. Maybe they're talking about secrets. Maybe they're talking about guilt. Maybe they're talking about a woman whose story refused to stay buried because Dorothy Thomas was weighed down with change and thrown into the Mississippi River. But somehow, she still came back. And decades later, so did the truth. Some secrets sink, but they do not always stay buried. As always, I make these videos for entertainment purposes only. and to give insight on the victim's situation, as well as spread awareness to avoid the situation from happening. You let me know what you thought about the story in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed the story, go ahead and argue with the like button about it. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Without further ado, we got real stories, real people, real facts with Brax.